In this video, we're going to go over a series of highly disturbing audio clips with highly disturbing backstories. The final clip has one of the most blood-curdling screams you will ever hear, and new information came out about it just this year, which has completely changed the mystery surrounding it. So make sure you listen to the end to hear the update to this decades-old mystery. With that said, it is very disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. I'm going to play you the first little bit of a song. The singer comes in at 15 seconds or so bear with me during the intro. That was Ave Maria, sung by Alessandro Moreschi. Now, although it's not something I would regularly listen to, I can definitely say that I think it's a beautiful song, and Alessandro is a beautiful singer. This is because Alessandro is a very special individual. Born on November 11th, 1858 to a Roman Catholic family about 20 kilometers southeast of Rome, Alessandro's singing talent was recognized from the time he was a young boy. This was eventually noticed by a talent scout who was a former member of the Sistine Chapel Choir, who then brought Alessandro to Rome at the age of 12 in 1870, where he became a student at a prestigious singing school under a famous composer and maestro. Then, between his natural talent and formal training, just 3 years later, at the age of 15, Alessandro was appointed as the first soprano in the choir of the Basilica. And for 10 years, he performed in this choir and honed his craft until 10 years later, he was placed in a showcase for the public. During this showcase, Alessandro nailed an incredibly demanding song and earned himself the nickname the Angel of Rome. On top of this nickname, his performance was good enough that he was then appointed the spot of the first soprano of the Sistine Chapel Choir, and he would go on to hold this prestigious position for 30 years. Now, if you know anything about singing, you might have found it odd that he was appointed the role of a soprano, because the classification of soprano is usually given to female singers who have the highest vocal range. Their natural singing register, the one they feel the most comfortable in, is on average within the highest set of notes of other singers, and this range is usually not sustainable by men. A man might be able to hit these notes on occasion, but their natural register will still usually be much lower. Generally, the highest voice classification given to men is that of the countertenor, and the primary reason for this difference is the hormone testosterone. Before puberty, boys and girls have fairly similar vocal ranges, and then at puberty, the increased testosterone in men promotes the development of secondary characteristics like increased muscle mass, body hair growth like facial hair, and voice deepening. Testosterone actually causes the larynx to get thicker and larger, which results in a deeper sound from male voices. A great example of this is the young Michael Jackson in the Jackson 5 compared to Michael Jackson later in life. Even though Michael Jackson is known for his high-pitched voice, it doesn't compare at all to his ability to sing such high notes so effortlessly like he did when he was a kid. This is a bit of a tangent, but if you want to hear this difference, just listen to any Jackson 5 song first, then listen to some of Michael Jackson's later songs. Even if you have an untrained ear, this difference should be pretty clear. So this begs the question, was Alessandro a true soprano? Was the scale back then different, or was he simply such an anomaly that he was a true soprano? The answer is unfortunately much more horrifying. The scale was not different, and Alessandro was a true soprano because Alessandro was something known as a castrato. These were individuals who were castrated before puberty for the sole purpose of preserving their prepubescent voice. And again, this was pre-puberty, so likely before the age of 10. And since chemical castration is a relatively recent invention, this was most commonly done by either severing the cords leading to the male testosterone-producing organs, or by crushing them by hand. Without the ability to produce testosterone, Alessandro's voice remained mostly unchanged from when he was a child. In addition to this also causes the bone joints not to harden correctly, resulting in unusually long limbs and ribs. Their large chest cavities, combined with the intense breath training, gave them abnormal lung power and breath capacity. Then, along with their small, childlike voices, the castrati had a completely unique sound from anything we know today. The recording of Alessandro is one of the only recordings of a castrato because, thankfully, this practice has been extinct for the last century and a half. Unfortunately, at the peak of this practice, around 4,000 individuals underwent this procedure annually, which is truly horrifying. I'm going to play the audio clip briefly once again, I think you'll find it has an entirely different quality to it now that you know the context. At just 20 years old, Amber had lived a happy but hard life. Throughout her childhood and into adulthood, her and her family struggled financially, and for a variety of reasons throughout this time as well, she went back and forth between her mom's house and the local women's shelter. In addition to these financial struggles, things were even harder because Amber got pregnant at just the age of 19, so by the age of 20, her son Jacob was already 14 months old. But despite these hardships, that didn't stop Amber from trying to enjoy things as much as she could. So when a friend of hers, Evangeline from the women's shelter, asked her if she wanted to take a trip one weekend, she excitedly agreed, and then the two of them decided to go to Edmonton, Alberta. Then in August of 2010, the two of them got on a plane in Fort McMurray, where they were living at the time, and made the hour flight to Edmonton. Now, Amber's mom, who Amber was very close with, didn't like the idea at all, especially because Amber was bringing Jacob along. Because of how young Jacob was, it just didn't seem like a good idea, but Amber reassured her mom that it would just be a short little trip and then they'd come right back. After arriving in Edmonton, the two of them decided to stay in one of the motels right beside the airport because the Edmonton airport is actually located about a 20-minute drive from the city itself. Then the following day, they would head into the city. But then as the night went on, Amber was just so excited to go into the city, she asked Evangeline if she could watch Jacob while she went in that night still. Evangeline agreed to this, and then Amber left the hotel and tried to hitch a ride with someone into the city. This is unfortunately an all too common practice in this part of Canada, where the distances are too large to walk and public transportation isn't always available. With Amber's financial situation as well, it just didn't make sense to take an expensive taxi, and she was used to hitchhiking anyway. Then at 8 p.m, a passing car stopped and Amber hopped in. This would unfortunately be the last time Amber was ever seen alive. Almost immediately, Amber's mom knew something was wrong. The two of them were in communication basically all day through text messages, and Amber abruptly stopped responding to her mom's messages. Then the following morning, when she hadn't returned to the hotel or called Evangeline, Amber's mom contacted the Canadian Federal Police, known as the RCMP. Unfortunately, the RCMP didn't really take her disappearance seriously and told her that she was probably out partying and that she'd need to wait 24 hours before they could do anything. Then, despite Amber's mom following up with them and Amber still missing, police seem to have done almost nothing to try and locate her. Even worse, just 2 weeks after she was first reported missing, someone reported a sighting of Amber that the police didn't verify but closed the case anyway and removed her from the missing persons database. She would be re-added to this database again a month later on the insistence of her mother, but by then they'd lost out on crucial time to try and find her. Then, frustrated by the lack of initiative of the police, Amber's mother traveled to the police department to look at the stuff that was collected from the hotel, only to find that some of it had simply been thrown out. And following this, the case basically went cold until almost 2 years later, to the day of her disappearance. In August of 2012, the RCMP released the audio of a phone call made by Amber on the day that she disappeared. Here is that audio.
Where are we by?
We're just heading south of Beaumont, or north of Beaumont.
We're heading north of Beaumont. Yo, where are we going?
Just
No, this is a... Are you f***ing kidding me? You better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go. I want to go into the city. Jeez. Yo, we're not going into the city, are we?
We're going.
No, we're not.
Yes.
Then where the f*** are these roads going to?
50th Street.
50th Street. Are you sure?
Absolutely.
Yo, where are we going?
50th Street.
50th Street?
50th Street.
East, right?
East.
Over town.
Bravo.
Bravo.
This 60-second clip that you just heard is actually part of a 17-minute long phone call made by Amber while she was in the car with whoever picked her up on the side of the road. By chance, Amber's brother, who was in prison at the time, had called her at the exact time she was in the man's vehicle. And because he was in prison where all outgoing calls were recorded, that phone call was captured. It's not clear exactly why the police decided to look into the case after all that time, but after discovering this phone call, they put the audio out to the public in hopes of identifying the man driving. And this seemed to work because right away, 3 people came forward and identified a man. The man was then brought in for questioning, but released shortly after and ruled out as a suspect. Incredibly, just 4 days after the phone call was released, a group was horseback riding just south of the motel Amber had stayed at and stumbled on some skeletal remains. Through an analysis of dental records, these remains were tragically identified as Amber's body. As far as I'm aware, the cause of death wasn't able to be determined or was never released to the public, and apparently Amber is one of 4 other First Nations women whose remains have been located in that area just a few kilometers from one another. But again, despite all of this, Amber's family said that they're rarely updated by police about any ongoing efforts to find her killer. So finally, after years of what seemed like inadequate policing, they'd had enough and filed a formal complaint in 2014. For years, it seemed as though nothing would come of this either, but then in 2018, a full 120-page independent review of the investigation conducted by the police was released and found that various members of the department were either not trained properly or didn't adhere to their training and didn't comply with procedures and guidelines. Like, for example, the investigation didn't start until at least a month after Amber's disappearance was first reported. Then from there, it took 4 months to start interviews, and in those 4 months, Evangeline wasn't even interviewed, even though she was the last person to see Amber alive. Then there was her removal from the database on an unconfirmed sighting, and then there was the fact that some of her stuff was simply thrown out. These revelations to the public would eventually force the police department to issue a formal apology, but understandably, the family rejected this apology, and to this day, there are no leads on the man in the phone call. The majority of calls that go through to 911 operators are your normal run-of-the-mill traffic accident. Then there are also medical emergencies that unfortunately happen on occasion. Sometimes these calls come in to report crimes like burglaries or other crimes that have just occurred. And sometimes, much more rarely, something exceedingly terrible gets called in. And probably the rarest of all, sometimes these events take place during the call. It's for this reason that 911 operators have to go through special training to ensure that they're prepared to stay calm and to be helpful even in the most tense and horrifying situations. Unfortunately, there isn't much better training for this than listening to recordings, so trainees will have to sit through a number of these recordings to understand how to react and to ensure that they're able to keep calm throughout. Their ability to think clearly and give and collect the right information can sometimes be the difference between life and death for the person on the phone. I'm now going to play you a recording that was taken decades ago that resulted in policy changes for 911 operators across the country. And once again, viewer discretion is advised because it is highly disturbing.
What's the problem, ma'am?
Oh, there's some guy been checking the place out.
How?
Well, he went in the back. I have an apartment in the back, and he said he was looking for a guy. And he comes to my door and said he's looking for an apartment. So I live alone, and I'm an old lady.
Mm-hmm. Where is he now, ma'am?
I don't have no idea.
That was the sound of someone who was as terrified as anyone could possibly be. Clearly, it was an older woman named Ruth who was calling in to report some suspicious person in and around her house, and part of the way through the call, it seems as though something horrible happened to Ruth shortly before the line disconnected. Now, to give some additional context, because there are 2 small edits to the audio, Ruth starts off by saying her full name, which is Ruth Price. Then she gave the first 4 numbers of her address, which were 3877, before being cut off by the operator. The call then continues for another several sentences before Ruth lets out that blood-curdling scream. The crucial mistake here is that the operator didn't get Ruth's address before she cut her off. Without that information, there would be no way to send help, which from the sounds of it condemned Ruth to some horrible fate. Despite the apparent severity of this call and despite how frequently it's used in training, information about the actual incident is more or less non-existent. In these training sessions, it's also always explained that this is a real call and that Ruth was killed as a result of this attack. But again, you'd think there would be some news story or Wikipedia page, but for the most part, it just exists in true crime forums and Reddit. And it's circulated this way for decades with people speculating about the call's origins. What is known about the call is that it's been around since at least the late 80s or early 90s, and the woman in the call is named Ruth Price. With only a name to go off of, people have scoured obituaries and news articles trying to find any incident that might be similar, but for the most part, these are all theories. And the two main theories are that it's exactly the story that's been told in training classes, or that it was fabricated purely for training purposes to demonstrate how not to take a call. But understandably, people have rejected this theory because of how genuine the scream sounds. Either the woman in the call is one of the most talented voice actors ever, or it really is a real call. For the last several decades, with no new information and no leads, it seemed that this would go down as unsolved true crime lore. That was until January of 2022. On the 6th of this year, a Redditor by the name of Far Valuable may have discovered pieces of information that fully explained the origins of the call. Apparently, this Redditor was listening to a true crime podcast that was discussing the case, with all the same questions and theories and mystery surrounding it. And thankfully, Far Valuable didn't stop at just listening. In addition to being a true crime fan, this Redditor also does genealogy as a hobby, and because of this hobby, is really good at digging through listings and directories and other publicly available information. Far Valuable then used one of the names mentioned in the podcast, which was Ruth Mildred Starr Price, and scoured the internet for any information about her. This is what they found. Ruth was born on December 7th, 1913. As a teenager, she attended Central High School in Colorado and later married a man named William Price. The two of them lived in Colorado for a few years before eventually moving to San Diego in the 1940s, where they had 2 daughters. There was little record of them for the next 30 years until unfortunately, William passed away in 1972. Following that, Far Valuable found several listings in the city directory from 1973 onward that showed that Ruth was living at 3877 North 35th Street, San Diego. This was the exact number given by the Ruth in the phone call. This just seemed way too close to be a coincidence. What are the odds that there would be 2 Ruth Prices with the same street number? Then, Far Valuable stumbled on the piece of information that would bring it all together. Here is a newspaper clip from an incident that occurred on November 3rd, 1980. On that day, a 76-year-old off of the block of 3800 35th Street was on the phone with police reporting someone suspicious in the area when she was attacked from behind. Amazingly, she was able to fight off this initial attack and cause the attacker to run off. She'd never seen the man before and had no idea why he attacked her, but thankfully she was completely unharmed. So taken all together, you have a woman by the same name, with the same address, and an incident that matches perfectly with the phone call. And incredibly, this Ruth Price had been looked at by other people, but was dismissed because her obituary is from 1994. Because the trainees are always told that this woman died, everyone thought that this couldn't be the right Ruth. Well, thankfully, this seems to be the right Ruth after all, and not only was she unharmed, but she lived for another 14 years after the incident until the age of 81. So it seems that this decades-old mystery has finally been solved. If you want to read the full post by Far Valuable, I will link it in the description. Hopefully you enjoyed that little bit of good news following how horrifying that audio clip is. Just a reminder, there is a Scary Interesting subreddit for story suggestions, or you can submit your own true stories directly to me by sending me an email, which you can find in the description. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.